My name is James Ellsmoor, and I'll be talking about climate change politics and islander innovation. So yesterday we heard a lot about how innovative islands are, and I want to unpick that a little bit using some of the framework that Laurie discussed earlier on from island studies. So just a quick outline. I'll briefly introduce the topic and run through my research questions, provide a bit of literature background. I have 5 case studies, which I know is too many for a presentation of this length, but they're all really brief, and I think it'll be helpful to run through them quickly and give an overview rather than go into depth. So just quickly who I am, I'm James Ellsmoor, as I said. I'm a master's student in island studies at the University of the Highlands and Islands, one of a handful of universities to offer that island studies degree. And the University of the Highlands and Islands was actually founded in 2011 to provide education to the rural north and west of Scotland. And so in itself is a pretty innovative exploration in providing public services to that region. So we talked a bit with Stacey about this idea of SIDS, and so I just want to quickly introduce that. Obviously we've all heard this acronym after 2 days of being here, and there are various different definitions of what SIDS means. Small, are these places small? Well, Papua New Guinea has a population double New Zealand and a surface area bigger than the Benelux countries in Germany, so they're not necessarily small. Are they islands? Well, these 4 countries are normally included, and none of those are islands, but we tend to include them in the definition of SIDS. Are they developing? Well, the definition that Stacey used included Singapore and Bahrain, so maybe not, and the Cayman Islands is up here as well. And are they states? Well, not all of them are independent. You know, do they have to be independent to be classed? So it's a really nebulous definition, and I'm going to do what Stacey did as well, which is use the broadest possible definition, which has 50, 60 odd countries included in it. What is islander innovation? So this idea that islands create a unique ecosystem for innovation, and actually turning on its head what we often hear about how remoteness, isolation, small populations are disadvantages, to look at the advantages of that. So high levels of social capital, constraints actually being a bonus because people are forced to be resourceful, and there's a culture of resourcefulness that you often don't find in mainland areas. And I've used this picture because often we think of islander innovation, we might think of cottage industries like this, or like basket weaving, those types of things. But I want to broaden that definition as well to think of all the different types of innovation that can be included. So the research questions: how does islander innovation shape SID's role in global climate change discourse? So particularly looking at the UNFCCC and the COPs, and what type of innovations have been used. I'm not going to try and evaluate the effectiveness of these innovations, but more just discuss approaches that have been used by these islands to be heard. And there are 2 lots of literature which I'm bringing from. Islander innovation is mostly from the Island Studies framework, and climate change politics, which has been looking at the COPs, as I mentioned. And these 2, there hasn't been a huge amount written about the intersection between these 2 areas, so that's what I want to try and approach. So Laurie introduced this earlier, this idea of islandness as opposed to insularity. Insularity has a lot of negative connotations, and so in island studies we like to approach this from a more neutral term of islandness. I don't think that's a real word, but it is now. The geographical situation of islands can actually be seen as a competitive advantage as opposed to a disadvantage, and so that drives entrepreneurship, and there's been a lot written about this and how the resourcefulness of islands is driven. And Elon managed to make it to the presentation, fortunately, so he can call me out if I misrepresent him in any way. But he wrote this action agenda which broadened the definition, I think, very helpfully of what islander innovation can be. So entrepreneurship and business might include those traditional handicrafts that we talked about, but also new governance structures and new cultural practices, and what those might entail for innovation on islands. In terms of climate change politics, we've already know SIDS are the smallest absolute contributors to global greenhouse gases emissions, but tend to bear the brunt of the consequences for climate change. SIDS actions have been developing renewable energy, and a lot of them are trying to reposition themselves to be leaders of of the fight against climate change, and that's what I want to get into a little bit now. The AOSIS, the Association of Small Island States, has been in existence since the 1990s, and that has been a key coalition at the United Nations and at the COPs that has been leading this discourse on climate change. And SIDS have had to have an entrepreneurial strategy to be heard. Although the United Nations does have a one nation, one vote policy, the structural way that it's organized still means that the largest countries do have the largest voices. And so they've had to use new strategies, one of which has been AOSIS and this grouping to have their arguments heard. And as I mentioned, SIDS are less than 1% of world territory, a minor contributor of greenhouse gases, but have been a significant force at the global climate change conferences. Sorry, my timer's just gone off. And importantly, the way that AOSIS has framed climate change has been as a crisis issue. One of the quotes I've got later on brings up Anote Tong of Kiribati, who about 3 years ago that said that the Kiribati would be uninhabitable in 5 years. That kind of bringing attention to this crisis and how soon it might be happening, even if it may be over-exaggeration, has been a strategy to have that voice heard, because we know how the mainstream media works and the way that the mainstream media likes to cover things. That has been their approach. So this intersection, I'll skip through that, we've kind of covered that. So my 5 case studies are all SIDS, but they're a specific group of SIDS. So they're the 5 SIDS that are entirely made up of atolls, or almost entirely in the case of Kiribati. The timer keeps going off, so I have to stay on time. I selected these, as I mentioned, because they're atolls, and so that idea of crisis has been used especially by those to say, with the absolutist idea that the country may entirely disappear in the next X number of years, and so they've been effectively using that to raise attention. And the innovation case studies I'm using are particularly led by their government on a national scale, and have had some kind of international component to them. Just a bit of background on the countries. You'll notice that the Maldives actually has a population bigger than the entire, the 4 other countries combined. And also that all 4 of the first ones are independent states with seats at the United Nations. Tokelau is the exception, which is currently a dependent territory within the realm of New Zealand. 3 atolls with about 1,200 people spread between them, depending on who you ask. And hopefully we know what atolls are, but just to give an idea of how they've been able to use this imagery of being atoll nations to raise awareness of the issues of sea level rise. So this picture is famous outside of even the environmental politics. People have seen this a lot, and it's actually something that's quite well known even today by the general public when we talk about SIDS and climate change. In, I forget the year, I think it was 2008, I'm going to say, maybe a little bit later. Mohammed Nasheed's government in the Maldives led this underwater cabinet meeting, which was designed to be a really visual representation of what they wanted to raise awareness with the rest of the world. And that was a really innovative strategy in terms of getting headlines across the world and being able to highlight this crisis issue. So it remains one of the most iconic issues today, and was really followed on by many other atoll countries in the way that they represented climate change. This film, has anyone seen this film? No, really? It's actually a really interesting approach into how the Maldives and Mohammed Nasheed approach this idea of climate change. I would really recommend it. I think it's on Netflix. But the fact that this film was made as well was another innovative approach to help the Maldives, with just 350,000 people, get the message out that it wanted to in terms of the urgency of climate change and how it wanted the global community to respond at that time. The second case study is Kiribati. That's me down here, walking through the land that Kiribati bought in Fiji, which was claimed that the entire population of Kiribati could be relocated to in the event of Kiribati's sinking in about 2 years' time, as Tom predicted. Whether that was actually the plan, or whether it was a great publicity stunt, or a combination of the two, to raise awareness of the issues, it doesn't really matter. The point is that this was another effort that got international headlines when it was claimed that Kiribati bought, 5 minutes, okay, when it was claimed that Kiribati bought this land to relocate its population to. And so I think that's a really important way of thinking about this, that this was actually as much about raising awareness as it was a serious plan to relocate the immediate population. And I could do a whole presentation on this land purchase itself if anyone's interested. It's a fascinating case study. Tuvalu is another country that's been very unusual in its approach, and at the United Nations was one of the first countries to bring emotion into the way that it talked, into a very kind of stiff governmental organization. So there's originally, I think, Tuvalu in Copenhagen, the delegates were filmed crying when it looked like the negotiations were going to fail. Now, I'm not saying that that was innovation in itself, but the way that they talked, the way that they brought in this whole idea of Tokelau and Tuvalu and Whenua and how they were associated with the land was the first time that a country had talked in that way to really bring in this emotional connection to the debates. The Marshall Islands, I think Laurie mentioned Kathy Jetnall-Kirchner. They actually brought her as part of their delegation to the United Nations to talk through poetry, and I'd really recommend you watching her if you haven't seen her perform, because it's a fascinating way of expressing the way that she feels about climate change and the way that she wants to get her message across. And so the fact that the government brought her to represent them in some ways was also an innovative approach in this stuffy UN environment. And Tokelau, which was a slightly different case study again, made world headlines with its efforts to reach 100% renewable energy I should have written the dates down, apologies, I think it was 2011, 2012. That is particularly interesting because although obviously there were efforts and the renewable energy was a development issue locally, and Tokelau had the world's highest energy costs and due to its remote location had to import diesel, it was also partly an effort to raise awareness and this idea of leadership by example to portray what it was doing. I'll read this quote out. This is from the Faipule, the leader of the islands at the time. "We're here to convey the message that nowhere in all of these meetings has Tokelau been able to have a voice in policy development. We are part of a group of vulnerable nations most affected by climate change, yet we do not have a presence within the formal discussion of the COP sessions. As a territory of New Zealand, Tokelau is not able to represent itself there." I'm rushing through these slides, apologies. So this is actually bringing these three areas that Ilan had highlighted in this paper I mentioned before of innovation. I tried to roughly group these in, don't pay too much attention to the position. These 5 case studies that I brought up in terms of where they fit between these categories, I don't think it's helpful to try and shove them into any particular category. But my point here is that actually I think we could even broaden further the approach of these 3 categories in terms of island innovation. I'm still trying to work out where these examples that I've used fit, but I don't think they directly correlate with any of these, and I'd love to kind of explore that idea of island innovation more, and particularly represent SIDS in that. I'll skip this slide. So, just as I'm running out of time, I wanted to bring up this idea of wishful thinking. I think it's a really good expression by Carol Falbotko. And the way that this has actually been a controversy within the nations itself. Do you as an atoll nation represent your country as something that's going to disappear in 5 or 6 years and all the trauma that that entails on your population, or which is how Anote Tong and the president of the Maldives, Nasheed at that time, were portraying their islands? Or do you take approach in Tokelau where you say, we want to be leaders, we were in this for the long haul, and we want to put in long-term development projects that show that we are actually not here, we're fighting, not drowning, and we'll be here for a long time. And that isn't a country-by-country approach. Even within countries, that is now a huge political debate, and was actually part of the reason, I think, why Nasheed's government was toppled, why Tong's government was voted out. This way that those politicians played into this idea of wishful thinking, which actually wasn't what the general population, how they felt. So to conclude the case studies I used all really focus on the centrality of state actors in some way, mostly in the international scale, but there is this interplay between what's happening locally and what's happening internationally, and these intersecting scales are really important. Atoll nations gain a voice in international attention. They have these dual narratives which are conflicting and opposing, and really an interesting way of raising their attention. And unfortunately, I think they, to an extent, atolls have been forced into this narrative of imminent demise in the next few years as a way of pushing attention to their development concerns. And this comes back to all the concerns we've been talking about of where climate change is prioritized over other development issues because of the global narrative that's been built into. So just a quick thank you for the University of the Highlands and Islands and the Students' Association for funding me to come here and present. To my thesis advisor currently, Dr. Andrew Jennings, and my previous thesis advisor, Elizabeth Havis at the University of North Carolina, and Liki Fepuli for Taloa and Paula Faber of Tokelau, who, when I was working in Tokelau, were very much instrumental in the research that I was doing. And unfortunately, Mr. Taloa has passed away, but was one of the leaders of the renewable energy project there. I'm not sure, are we doing questions now or after?
I think we take the questions after the next paper.
Okay.
If that's time. No, we'll take them now if you want.
Okay. I also wanted to plug this link here at the bottom. I run a newsletter called Islander Innovation, where I monthly send out different examples. So if you'd like to visit that and subscribe, I'd be very grateful. I'll send the next one out in a few weeks and cover a whole range of different Islander innovations in that.
Okay, so questions now.
So Udan Calvin, University College London, thank you very much for a very insightful and highly critical presentation, which I think is exactly the sort of analyses that we need. You've absolutely used climate change in the appropriate manner, especially the crisis generation. What I'm curious is, how much do you think crisis is needed to spur on or garner attention for innovation?
I think it's a really difficult one, and these two dual narratives are really opposing. I think, unfortunately, it's the way that atoll nations can be heard on the international stage is by pushing this crisis narrative, even if it conflicts. Because why would you give money to donate to sustainable development or any building schools or anything in a country that isn't going to be there in 5 years' time? But at the same time, that has been the effective way for countries to leverage international funding by pushing the climate change narrative. And unfortunately, what we see now is that most development funding, particularly in SIDS, is tied to climate change. So even if you want to do an education project or a health project, you have to talk about climate change to actually get the money. So I don't think I think that's the problem at the institutional level, but I think SIDS countries need to kind of play into that if they want to be successful in leveraging the funding. Did that answer your question?
Isn't the problem also that crisis narratives generate skepticism and cynicism among certain fields and sectors?
Yeah, I think so, and
it could backfire dangerously.
Yeah, and I think it has to a point. I mean, there's I've forgotten the name of the University of Auckland, the professor there that does the geomorphological research.
Paul Kench.
Paul Kench. And his research is often cited by climate denialists to say, oh, well, atoll nations don't need to worry because they'll still be there. And actually, his point is not that, not necessarily that atoll nations are not going to suffer the effects of climate change, but that geomorphology is a bit more complicated. So I think, yeah, the crisis narrative does, in the long term, play against the interest, but you have this individual, whether it's individual countries or individual groups, interests and the global interest, and those two different interests don't necessarily line up in the long and the short term. So people have to play to what is most useful for their own interests, and that's the issue.
Rosemary.
Hi, I was just wondering, perhaps through personal experience or perhaps through the literature, what do these different narratives, what effect do they have on local populations in terms of community adaptation and disaster risk responses and so on, in the sense that perhaps the crisis narrative is very dispiriting, but it could also spur action. And on the other hand, the hope narrative is also something that that might spur action. Do you have any comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a huge issue because on the one hand, the hope narrative means that some people say, well, we don't need to prepare for climate change. Let's just carry on as normal and pretend it's not happening, which isn't helpful. But abandoning our nation, abandoning our countries and our islands tomorrow and not building any more infrastructure is not helpful. So there's a really delicate line there in between them. And you also have many religious groups in atolls that say that the flood has already happened. The Great Flood has already happened, and that God will not desert us again, and God will not allow a Great Flood, which is a strong percentage of the population in several atoll nations. I think an interesting one is Mohammed Nasheed in the Maldives, and the fact that he was the only democratically elected leader the country has had, and was taken down in what many call a coup, because it was felt that the narrative he was pushing, where he was flying all over the world saying, oh, my atoll's disappearing, you know, and he was using that as a way of getting money for his country, was kind of opposed to what local people felt, who have their day-to-day issues of health and education and everything else we want to worry about. So I think that was part of the thing that pushed the coup, and there's been a political issue in other countries where what is needed and expected by the global community and what politicians are forced into to attract the development funding that they rely on doesn't necessarily play with what local politics requires.
I think we must postpone further questions till the end of the session, but I think it's worth pointing out that the new president of Kiribati has said we are more than climate change, and is really pushing out of island development, and that she said that we didn't buy this island for migration, we bought it for agriculture, and we're going to start planting things this soon.
To me, that sounds like somebody who has something that they're not quite sure why they bought it and said something exactly. I stayed in that village in Fiji. There's already a village on the land that Kiribati bought, and they were very worried about what's going to happen when 100,000 Kiribati people turn up on their doorstep.
Okay.